and we are celebrating the birth of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in this week. I believe tomorrow is the Mawlid an-Nabi, the birth of Prophet Muhammad. And the topic is beautiful, and we have a great scholar to present to us. And today's topic, the title is The Importance of the Birth of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for Muslim life and humanity. And our speaker is going to be Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, inshallah. So Dr. Khaled is the Omar and Azmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law. And he is a great scholar and the author of numerous books such as Great Theft and Reasoning with God and so many others. So to present his talk, I would like to invite Dr. Khaled to the podium. Dr. Khaled.
Assalamu alaikum. So the Prophet ﷺ, his birthday is coming upon us. And I pray to Allah that the number of people here is not a reflection of our lack of awareness about the importance either of the date or the event. Because it is, if to put it so simply and basically, in the lives of any Muslim on the face of this earth that is worthy of the name Muslim, to be a Muslim, Allah has blessed us with a living example of what it is to embody Islam, to actually manifest Islam in life. We all understand conceptually, basically in the most general way, that Islam is the faith of monotheism, and that monotheism, although innate and natural to the human intellect and the human brain, it has proven historically elusive to human beings. That for centuries, God reminds human beings of the basic fact that their Creator is one and only, and that the Creator did not just create human beings, but is an engaged creator. Unlike the systems of belief that prevailed throughout human history, human beings could conceptualize, could understand the idea of a creator, the idea of a God. And they gravitated towards the belief in a deity. But what they had a particularly challenging time with, and a particularly difficult process with, is knowing how to relate in concrete and basic ways with this Creator. And as a result, human beings, through their social institutions, would always effectively end up creating a class of clergy or holy men that mediate and negotiate the relationship between them and God. it's as if human beings could not imagine that they could have a direct relationship with a God, and therefore would always end up creating intercessionary idols. Idols, whether these idols are physiological, breathing, living, or symbolic in the form of images, stones, pictures, animals, planets, whatever the intercessionary medium is. But the basic idea is that there would be always an intercessionary element or an intercessionary force that translates to them what the God or the deity wants. And so monotheism has proven to be anthropologically, sociologically, it's difficult to take hold among human beings. And as Muslims know, this process needed to be broken, and broken in a fundamental and final way, and in a concrete and specific way. And the level of maturity among human beings mandated that Allah gives deposit among human beings the final faith where the idea of intercessionary class playing a symbolic role like idols or the different forms of idols would be preempted. But here comes the importance of the Prophet ﷺ and his role. The Prophet ﷺ was the living embodiment, the actual living embodiment of what it means to have godliness on earth. We can understand the belief in God, but can we visualize how is it to actualize our belief in God? Can we form a prototype, if you will, an actual example of what does it mean for a human being to say, I worship God and no other but God, and I submit to God and to no other but God, that I stand for the things that God wants me to stand for. Not all human beings are of the same intellectual ability, and not all human beings are of the same creative abilities. And not all human beings have the same tendencies and aspirations. There is where a living example becomes critical. An actual example of a human being that can manifest the principles and ethics of Tawheed that human beings can in turn relate to. And that is why Allah underscores so many times in the Qur'an, time and time again, that Muhammad was nothing but a human being. It's as if Allah is telling us, remember that as you will struggle with Tawheed, I have created for you a living, breathing example of what Tawheed, the ways that Tawheed should manifest, the way that Tawheed should shape your character, the way that Tawheed should revolutionize what is inside of you. But I will go even further than that. Up to Islam, we have a long line of Abrahamic prophets all descended from the blood of Ibrahim alayhi. If you study each of these prophets, what remains in history, what we know about what they manifested in history, is always mediated through the roles of their disciples. So for instance, Jesus lived a very short period of time on earth, and what modern Christians know about Jesus has primarily been, and this is even if you accept the Christian narrative of history, has been primarily being mediated through the disciples of Jesus. So we know that the Testaments, as they are written, they were written with a significant time gap after the death of Jesus, and that the most basic ethical paradigms that Jesus stood for come through the various disciples of Jesus, and especially in the Christianity that prevails today, Pauline Christianity, through Paul, the disciple. Moses, we know what the Qur'an says about him. We know partially represented through the Torah, but the Torah is not, as it survives, is not the testament of Moses. But what we know about Moses and Harun and so on, historically speaking, has been mediated through the tribes of Israel and the Israelite tribes that followed Moses. And these are the two primary examples. In the case of the Prophet Muhammad, it's a completely different matter. Not just because of the Qur'an, but because the living moral example was not represented. It's not that disciples represented the moral example of Muhammad, as is in the case of Jesus or Moses or other Abrahamic prophets, but the moral example of the Prophet ﷺ was represented by the Prophet himself. And often the issue that we study is whether the disciples lived up to the moral example that the Prophet ﷺ himself set. So there is no living example of Islam without the Prophet Muhammad. There is no living example of Islam without the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims failing in reflecting and understanding and internalizing what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ stood for will often be left with the text of the Qur'an, but putting themselves at a or you could say it really is complete loss, because the text of the Qur'an itself functions only by engaging and interacting with the moral living example of the Prophet ﷺ. That is why when you read the Qur'an, you will often find that the Qur'an is speaking to the Prophet or speaking to the followers of the Prophet. So if you read the Qur'an without understanding the identity of what the discourse of the Qur'an is directed to, it's like looking at one side of a coin. You get immediately, not just a misimpression, but you get half the picture. And it's not anywhere near the possibility and the potential that you can achieve by getting the full picture. You can do this experiment yourself. Just open the Qur'an at any page, and I'm willing to bet you that the page you open it on, the chances are, is Allah is speaking to the Prophet ﷺ. The Qur'an works by understanding that dynamic, where the Qur'an speaks and the Prophet ﷺ receives. And so knowledge of the Prophet is in fact the key to unlocking the message of the Qur'an. So when modern Muslims, and there is a tendency, unfortunately, it's rather ironic that from the time that the Muhammadian Risala began, our Prophet has always been a target of his enemies, whether in Mecca or in Arabia or later on in the West or the colonial period through a whole army of Orientalist scholars, or in the modern age, Islamophobes. I'll use the word, our enemies have understood this much better than we have, that by going after the Prophet ﷺ, they effectively go after Islam and cut Islam at the knees. And when modern Muslims, because modern Muslims especially are uneducated and ignorant, fail to understand that it is like a chemical formula. The Qur'an with the Prophet gives you the divine message. But the Qur'an without the Prophet, you're left with something that is deformed and fundamentally incomplete. Now, when we celebrate the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, we celebrate not just the physical human being, because unfortunately we were born 17 generations or so, 15 to 17 generations after the death of the Prophet, and that, of course, time is always an impediment to a lot of things. But we are celebrating moral qualities through which the Prophet ﷺ demonstrated and actuated and what is the word I'm looking for? It ignited the message of the Qur'an, actually demonstrated the power it has on the ground. So keep in mind, and this is important for us to always remember and think about. Arabia, at the time that the Prophet ﷺ receives the message, is an area of the world that is tribal, limited in literary abilities, without a civilizational track, and that is chaotically heathenistic in its aspirations and inclinations. Arabia is anchored on the principle of material fulfillment and material gain. It's a consumer society. It's a society that consumes and acts as a mediator of wealth, but other than mercantile values that have to do with business, taking money, giving money, so on, dealing with money. It is not a humanistic center of the world. It's not a center in which human values have flourished or emerged. Unlike, for instance, Greece, and unlike the Roman tradition, unlike even the Indian tradition or the Chinese tradition over 1,000 years or over 1,500 years ago. Part of understanding what the Prophet meant in the context of Arabia is to understand the values by which this man managed to achieve truly a miracle. Imagine one human being sent to the heart of Las Vegas that turns Las Vegas, instead of a center of gambling and prostitution and entertainment, into a major center of ethics and thought and philosophy in the world. What type of human being can do that? And that is why when we tell the story of the Prophet, one of the most unfortunate things that modern Muslims unfortunately do, and again, modern Muslims are following in the footsteps of Orientalists, Western scholars on Islam, because that's, during the colonial era, that's how they studied history and that's how they learned history, and they never managed to break away from that. They present the story of the Prophet ﷺ through themes that mattered a great deal to the colonizer of Islam. The themes of an orphan, an older man, a younger businessman marrying an older woman, and then a migration leading to the constitution of Medina, and then a series of battles and wars. That narrative, these themes, an orphan, business, marriage, constitution, war, is the type of narrative that we inherited from Orientalist scholars of Islam, from basically the colonial institutions that had colonized the Muslim world and wrote the very first histories of the Prophet Muhammad in a modern language. I'm not talking about Kutub al-Siyar, the old classical books, because none of you, or assuming you're not trained academics, know how to read the books of Siyar. That's not you haven't been trained to do it. But if you, as modern human beings, you read books of history, and that's how the books of history have been written. In fact, the Muslim narratives, the pre-colonial narratives, the way that they approached the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was through the medium of the age by which you analyze the moral character of a human being. And that's anecdotes. There's a difference between history and anecdotes of morality. If I have a student today, I wouldn't assign to them books of Sirah, or even a book like the one written by Karen Armstrong about the history of the Prophet ﷺ, because they won't understand anything. It doesn't teach you anything about what was so special about this man that he managed to transform the Las Vegas of the Arabs into a major world civilizational power, you might be able to get a much closer understanding of this through the moral anecdotes, stories of moral anecdotes that shows you the humanity of the Prophet. What his actual moral narratives and moral lessons were. What were the ethics that he transmitted to his followers and how he instilled these ethics in. I do an exercise that sometimes is useful. I ask my students to visualize, or even write down, the moral values that the Prophet put in practice in his lifetime. What are the moral values that we know that any fair or any follower of the Prophet would know existed at the core of the Nabi? So for example, one basic core moral value, we know that he was arid. Arid is not just a person who worships, but a person who worships constantly and ceaselessly, in a constant state of worship. Is this important? Absolutely. You cannot begin to understand who the Prophet Muhammad was without understanding the fact that he was arid, a person in constant state of supplication and prayer and remembrance. If you want to start approaching the ethical paradigm that the Prophet left us, you cannot do without imitating that element. Because ibadah, in our cool world, people talk about, what is it called, yoga and stuff like that. And they tell you, well, if you want to handle the pressures of life, and then they tell you, imagine, take yoga and multiply it in a couple of thousand or a few thousand. The role of ibadah, the role of worship for the Prophet and the personality of the Prophet and the identity of the Prophet is like a key that unlocks or starts to unlock even your understanding the anecdotal, moral example that this man left behind. What else was he? And again, we strip down the values that we all, even if we don't know, but our hearts tell us that he must have had. We all know that he was persistently known as a Sadiq al-Amin. Constantly, unwaveringly, unconditionally truthful. And constantly and unwaveringly responsible for whatever he promises or takes charge of. He would never betray, in other words. He would never violate a trust. Now, so imagine a man that constantly in a state of remembrance of Allah and constant state of worship and is painfully truthful, never lies. Even in politics, doesn't lie. Doesn't lie with his family, doesn't lie with his friends, doesn't lie in his business, and never violates a trust. If he says a word, again, these are just basic knowledge of the moral anecdotes that the Prophet ﷺ left behind. If he says a word, it's gold. Never break it. So, okay, what else? Sada bil-haqq wa-adl. What does this mean? A man from the beginning, even before he receives the revelation, he is famous for his ability to see an injustice, if unfairness, inequality or inequity or injustice is committed around him, he immediately notices it. And if he is able to do something about it, we know he does. So from before he becomes a prophet, his first 40 years of life, and the 20 years or so after he receives the revelation rather, we know that he is vigilant in noticing injustices and vigilant in standing on the side of justice. That's very hard to contest. I'm just saying things that are so basic, they're nearly obvious. A man, constant remembrance, doesn't lie, absolutely trustworthy and reliable, doesn't betray, and a man who notices the injustices, even the injustices in society that the rest of society doesn't notice. It has this antenna. But not only that, once he notices an injustice, he can't shut up about it. What else can we unpack about his moral character? We know that, again, before he receives the revelation and after he receives the revelation, that he's a mild-mannered man. He's not loud, he's not bombastic. He doesn't, even when he laughs, he doesn't laugh loudly. But he is rarely seen frowning, and he wears his emotions on his face. So when he was upset of something, everyone would notice, and everyone would immediately, what's wrong? A transparent man. A man without filters. A transparent human being. And a human being that is so modest that in his entire lifetime we don't have a single report, not even by his enemies, and this is important, not even by his enemies, where he is caught praising himself or bragging about himself. We don't have a single report in which he says, I am the son of such and such. Why do you treat me this way? He has an incredible quietude about it and serenity. And that he is, by nature, a very moderate man that is bashful. So bashful that when he would hear something like an inappropriate joke, his entire face would blush. And even the descriptions, he would blush like a bride on her night. Now, we don't even need to get to the point of intelligence because he was known as a sharp, intelligent man. But the intelligence is often contextual, and it depends on what field, so we're not even going to talk about that. But we're talking about moral characters as represented to us through the anecdotes, the moral anecdotes that were remembered about his moral example. We also know that if there is something that would consistently describe his character, is that he is unwaveringly merciful. He always notices the position of the disempowered and sides with the disempowered against the empowered. So those who tend to gather around him are those in society that feel alienated and unintegrated, and he becomes their voice. Wasn't that his entire legacy in Mecca? And even after migrating to Medina, the amount of anecdotes about converts that would come to Medina and say, well, we broke away from our tribes because now we're Muslim converts, we have nothing, and we are on the margins of society. Who would be their voice? It was the Prophet ﷺ. So it's a constant and endless dynamic in which anyone that feels alienated and disempowered in society, who would they go to represent them, to speak for them, to embrace them, to take them in? It would be the Prophet ﷺ. His mercy, even, we know again from numerous anecdotal narratives, extends to not just men and women and children, but even living stock in a society that was as cruel with animals as we are today with the animals that we butcher, if you've ever read about the way we treat cattle. But the Prophet ﷺ taught Arabs that even if you put a trademark on an animal, that you can't put it on the face, because that, well, one, it was considered demeaning to the animal, disrespectful to the animal, but that the face is more sensitive than the rest of the body, so the Prophet's teachings was you can't hurt the animal. Even taught those Arabs that you can't kill an ant without cause. You have to have a reason for eliminating an ant. If you don't bother it. So this mercy and the stories about the way he dealt with children, there's so many. If you're interested, I have an 8-hour halaqah about the humanity of the Prophet that you can listen to. It's recorded. You can ask Grace. Now, the sum total of this, and this is the most critical point that I can leave you with. The Prophet ﷺ, during his legacy in Mecca and Medina, did not just transmit the faith. He wasn't just the recipient of a message from Gabriel. But in building a civilization that endured for centuries after his death, he built human beings. He had dignity. Part of the essential part of his character is that although very modest, he was a thoroughly dignified man, so dignified that even his enemies, when they visited from Byzantium, commented about how dignified his demeanor was. But he taught dignity to his disciples. His disciples were not slaves that took orders and implemented orders. They were not yes men. But he built the internal character, the dignity of a human being, the sense of self-worth of a human being. And he did it through the instrument of a moral example and something very basic that the Qur'an reminds us of. We call it shura, and we say it often, although we don't really know a lot about it. But as a prophet, can you imagine if you are receiving revelation from Allah? Personally, if I would be receiving revelation from Allah, why do I need to consult any of you? Shura is consultation. If you have Allah talking to you, why bother consult with human beings? The fact that you have a prophet receiving revelations and yet consultation doesn't deal despotically with society. It's not my way or the highway. It is not the way I see things, or the rest of you just shut up and follow me because I know better. His character was anchored in the concept of shura, anchored in the concept of coming to a consensus, consulting, listening. Among the things that we know from the anecdotal narratives about his morality, was he was an amazingly good listener. Would listen far more than he speaks. So, the least we can do, as the birthday of the Prophet is coming up tomorrow or after tomorrow, I think some days, some countries are taking Tuesday off. I wish, well, let me put it differently. It is astounding to me that we live in this day and age and we do not have institutes and we do not have research centers that specialize in studying the Prophet and his moral example. In fact, modern Muslims, having caught the Islamophobic virus, been affected by the Islamophobic virus, are often bashful and shy about their prophet. They're not quite sure what to do about their prophet. Many of our children do not even learn what is so significant and amazing. Why is it that hundreds and thousands of love poetry was written about this man? Why is it that Muslims for centuries, understood innately that the conversation, or you might understand conversation the wrong way, but the discourse, the dynamic discourse between the Qur'an as Allah's word and the Prophet as a man of great moral character ends up giving you the Islamic truth. You take one of them out of the equation, everything falls flat. It boggles my mind that modern Muslims talk about the Prophet ﷺ through hadith, and that the seerah they read is written per colonial epistemology. Orphan, businessman, marriage, wars. It's as if you are reading half the Qur'an, or even worse, it's as if you are covering half the page of each page of the Qur'an and reading it and say, I read the Qur'an. That's if you read the Qur'an. Allah has given us a living moral example of how it is to live not in the shadow of God, but in the company of God. This is a living moral example of what it is to be a human being that is godly, Rabbani. And when we ignore it at our own great loss. But if we want to realize it, then every birthday of the Prophet, at a minimum, should be an opportunity in which we remind ourselves of the basic moral values that this man stood for, and the basic moral values that we want our children to understand and stand for. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Khaled. We have 10 minutes before the prayer. If you have questions, we'll take few, and then after the prayer, we'll continue, inshallah. So I'm going to give it to you first, and then we'll... Here you go. Yeah, I thought you raised your hand. No?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, okay.
I just had a question. What books would you recommend?
I actually don't recommend any of the books written about the life of the Prophet, because of the problem that I described. I do recommend books that are written on Islamic ethics that cite to the Prophet as a moral example. So, for instance, you would even, a book that was written a while ago that I like is by Farid Azak, The Qur'an and Liberation, in which he talks about especially the liberation aspect. There is a very good book, but it's a little bit too tough to find, although of course in the day of electronics, probably everything you can find. It's by Izutsu, called Ethical Religious Concepts of the Qur'an. Fazl Rahman's book, Major Themes of the Qur'an, again, achieves that thing where it shows you the moral values and then emphasizing the anecdotal morality of what the Prophet ﷺ stood for. The sad thing is that I really, again, I stood on this podium so many times, said the same thing over and over now for 30 years, practically. If I had my way, I would fund institutions to study the moral values, the ethical values that this man stood for, and to articulate them in a way that is relevant and pertinent for our children. Because the biggest problem is that when we just present historical narrative to our children, they're not quite sure what to get out of it. That he was a great military commander, but that was incidental to what the Prophet was. The fact that there were battles and wars, the fact that this happened in Badr, and that happened in Uhud, and that happened in Hunayn. In fact, these were all contextual, a result of the historical moment and the place that he was created in. But it is far from the moral values that our children need. Because if you want to live in the sunnah of the Prophet, if you want to follow the footsteps, if you want to embody the sunnah of the Prophet, you imitate precisely the moral values. Like, for instance, Saddah bil-Haq, someone who is vigilant in standing with those who suffer an injustice. Someone whose relationship with the world understands that the world is a place where you bear witness for Allah, but you do not become attached to the temptations of this world. That you say that, but that's such a hard, difficult thing. Because in every situation you say, well, I don't care what people think. What I care about is to bear witness for Allah. And this world, my relationship with this world is that basically I bring Allah to be in my company, in my daily living in this world. It's a consistent moral standard that even would teach us and teach our children the beautiful art of tranquility, sakina. Because that's something we all lack, and especially in the day and age of video games. Video games, among the things that our children, all our children, are raised doing is video games. Well, video games can teach you a lot of different skills, but it cannot teach you the art of tranquility, the art of sakina, that creates a human being that doesn't go from 0 to 100 in a millisecond. In the same way that people have to work very hard at yoga to just learn how to breathe correctly and be serene, well, sakina is this and 100 times more. But to achieve the Muslim objective of a balanced human being, you need that critical factor of sakina, that tranquility. And that, in my view, can only be learned by reflecting and internalizing the example of the Prophet ﷺ. Because this is a man who he wasn't like Jesus, who has a very short life. We actually don't know very much about Jesus. Or Moses, again, we don't know very much about his upbringing, but, actual historical facts. But that's very different than the Prophet. Very different. And so this is a man that neither rejected the world, the material world, and said, I have nothing to do with it, I'm living in isolation until I die. But at the same time, never indulged in the material world. And that balance, look at our modern world. If there's anything we miss, it's that balance, that ability to enjoy Allah's blessings without it ever making us material human beings who exist and die and end in this dunya. How can you learn that example if it's not from the Prophet? And so I wish, I keep saying the same thing. I just wish that when will Muslims wake up and start realizing, it's either the Orientalists who are going to tell the story of your Prophet, or the Wahhabis are going to tell you the story of your Prophet, or you invest in your own institutions to tell the story of your Prophet from your iman, from your perspective. By the way, I can give you the names of other books later. Because one of them, there's a very good book that came out by a Filipino professor, a Muslim Filipino professor. I just can't remember its name. It's actually quite good. It's a very good book.
Okay, we have one more question by Dr. Mahmoud, and then we'll pray, inshallah.
Thank you, Dr. Khaled. For the first time I see or I hear a lecture about Prophet Muhammad away from the battles and the fights and so on. And I just wonder, when I look to the mighty Prophet, we understand Moses was a product of Israelite culture and Israelite history and Egyptian empire kind of thinking. So he was influenced by the environment that he grew up with. Jesus grew up as a Jew, and he came, and when he turned the table against the Jewish establishment, he became the enemy. But he's basically a Jewish reformer. So there is a cultural background for these mighty prophets that they are indebted to. When I talk about Prophet Muhammad and his history, we know he received the message at the age of 40. And when we read the Sirah, they're talking about fiction stories, about lots of things about his youth. Where is his culture, his intelligence, his personality, his moral percept came before the message itself? And is it, that's the meaning of an-Ummi, an-Nabi al-Ummi, the one that was not influenced with any other culture, and it was intended that way by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he's gonna come with the pure final message from Allah to humanity. I wouldn't dare to ask anyone this question but you.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, because we definitely know that this is a human being that did not live in a fantastical world. In other words, he didn't deny the reality of his historical circumstance. He in fact engaged it very much. But, in studying his legacy and his seerah, we can identify aspects where the culture itself imposes a logic that is remarkably powerful. So for instance, the reality of slavery in that culture and the pervasiveness in the institutions of slavery, or the realities of marital practices that were prevalent throughout the region of Arabia and the Mediterranean, leave alone, the Gulf area. But what is fascinating and far more interesting is to see the ways that he negotiated ethical values in dealing with these historical realities. That, to me, it's where you extract the lesson, because for someone who exists above the challenges, sort of saying, well, I'm just going to stay in my dignity and in my honor and at home, and not take on the challenges of the historical challenges that surround him. That happens. We have many examples of personalities in Islamic and non-Islamic history of basically mystical types, saintly types that stood above the historical circumstance. The Prophet ﷺ engaged his historical circumstance, and that is why the need for renewed study and scholarship, because our knowledge as human beings, our knowledge of how to do history has itself progressed a great deal. The progress is not just in medicine and engineering and technology. Progress also is in how you do research in the humanities and in the social sciences. And applying our knowledge of historiography and ethics, we can shed light upon the values that this man represented in ways that would be relevant not just for Muslims, but for humanity. Now, so one of the things I can, this is from my study of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, is that this is a man that, in our modern terms, you can describe as a practitioner of liberation theology. So this is just one example. Liberation theology meaning someone who was a sworn enemy of imposed subservience by a human being against another. Someone who was constantly in a state of rebellion against the powerful and on the side of the weak. Now, our telling seerah today doesn't emphasize at all that. It doesn't emphasize at all the fact that this was a man that was intensely opposed to despotic ways of leading life. I mean, when I watch Muslims today and I see the problem they have with despotism around the world, it's sad because many Muslims today don't realize how despotism is an anathema, absolutely inconsistent with what the Prophet ﷺ stood for. You can't imagine that you are following the sunnah of the Prophet if your life is despotic. If it's despotic in your family, despotic in your society, despotic in your politics, despotism is in itself shirk billah. It's a form of associating partners with Allah. Now, imagine that basic theology, imagine what it can do to Muslims if they understand it. It is istibdad shirk. Simple. And we learn that from an-Nabi Muhammad ﷺ. Because no prophet rebelled against despotism as much as this man did. In example after example after example after example, many of us even don't read his letters or his writings to the various tribes in which he complains that the way that these tribes have subjugated human beings and mistreated human beings. For the sake of our children, and you know what, one of the things that always bothers me when I come speak here is that we never have any of the upcoming generation, you know, always talking to old fogies like myself. You know, good, but our children need to understand. Our children need to understand why this was a great man that serves as a moral example for us. And if our children don't understand, they'll get very confused because they will quickly attach themselves to another moral example. Because we work through moral examples as human beings. That's the way we function. If we are not successful in explaining to our children why the Prophet Muhammad was the moral example that they need, they're going to find another moral example, and you know the rest of the story. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khaled. Thank you.